Hi guys and welcome to China Perspectives. My name is 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝗶𝗀𝗃 and you may know me as a German recruiter in Asia. Money makes the world go round, but it is not enough to have money, you also need to spend it. At least that is what countries and companies want you to do. And if you don't, then, one country may buy more from the other country than the other way around. And then this is what we call trade imbalances. The current trade imbalance between China and the US has led us to the situation we are in globally at the moment, since a certain someone took over this year in the US. But purchasing power is not only important on a global scale, but also domestically. So much of everyone's economy depends on how much people are spending and for what. And at the moment, many of us have heard in the news, or if you're living here in China, then you see it in the absence of shoppers in the street and stores, that consumers in China save fiercely instead of spending fiercely. This in itself is not new. Chinese households always had a very high saving rate. But this already high rate has further increased in 2025. So today, we are diving into household saving rates and average wealth across all of China. We'll explore what it is that makes Chinese households want to save instead of wanting to splurge, how wealth is distributed and what this means for businesses and potentially even geopolitics in this year and the next years. And yes, of course, there's a difference between individual household purchases and trade between countries. China mainly imports energy, agricultural products and advanced machinery from the US to support its industries and growing middle class. In contrast, the US imports mostly finished consumer goods like electronics, appeal, household items, and so on from China. This reflects China's role as a manufacturing hub and the US's role as a major consumer market. So there's a lot to be said about this, but this honestly would be its own video. Let's just say that both countries are very different in terms of what they produce and what they need and how they spend. Both countries influence trade financially and politically. But back to the average Chinese consumer and why they are buying or not buying stuff. And let's maybe first start with these three definitions so we're all on the same page, because sometimes, people get confused with these terms, and I hope this can be helpful for you. So first we have what is called household saving rate. This is a percentage of disposable income that households actually save instead of spending it. So this one reflects real saving behavior, and it's literally what the name says. A household can have different sizes of members, and it's defined by one or several individuals who live as a single economic unit. And then we have the saving deposit interest rate. This is the interest rates that banks pay on saving deposits. It influences incentives to save, but it's not the saving rate itself. A change here makes it more or less attractive to keep money in the bank account, and government and institutions use it to try and stimulate consumptions, or sometimes reduce it if it runs too hot. Higher rates mean you can get more interest, which usually means people keep their money in the bank account instead of investing it elsewhere. And then we have the so-called gross saving rate, the total saving rate of a country, including households, corporations, and government. So this refers to a country, not to a household or an individual. The national gross saving rate, which includes all sectors, is a whopping 44.3% of GDP in China. As a reference, this is about 18.23% for the US in the year 2023, so there's a big gap too. Okay, great. So with the definitions out of the way, let's look at China's household saving rates. It's historically always been high compared to many other countries. Some countries which have an even higher saving rate are, for example, Singapore, you have Qatar, or you have Ireland, just to name a few. The Chinese household saving rate was about 24.5% in 2024, lower than during the pandemic, when uncertainty and the simple fact that, everything was closed and you simply could not go out and go shopping increased saving rates drastically. Overall, this still is reflecting a decrease from the historically higher rates seen in earlier years, above 30, even 34%, as consumption recovers and government policies aim to boost domestic demand. In contrast, the US personal saving rate is much lower, around 4.5% in May 2025, below the long-term average of 8.4%. Americans tend to spend more and save less, supported by easier credit, different social safety nets, and a culturally different attitude to saving money. And Germany, that is where I'm from, sits somewhere in the middle with a saving rate of around 20% or so at the end of 2024. Germans are also traditionally cautious savers, but their saving rate is lower than China's gross saving rate. For both countries, the pandemic times drove saving rates up a lot, and it has been coming down since then. Interestingly, the bank deposit rate in China is quite low, and the government has lowered the maximum deposit rates that the banks here in China can offer to their customers. The move came days after China cut benchmark lending rates and state banks reduced their baseline deposit rate. The one-year fixed-term deposit rate was lowered by 15 basis points to 0.95%, as announced by the Industrial Commercial Bank of China, the China Construction Bank, the China Agricultural Bank, and the China Merchants Bank in May this very year. After the adjustment, the rates for fixed-term deposits now stands at 1.05% for 2 years, 1.25% for 3 years, and 1.3% for 5 years. What also happened recently is that everybody who had a bank loan at a bank in China, which honestly are the large majority of all Chinese people, as home ownership is very, very important, that the monthly rates they had to pay back to the bank for their loan got automatically lowered. So I remember that I asked around some of my friends, and their average monthly rate was slashed by around somewhere 300 to 1,000 RMB per month. So that's roughly somewhere between $40 to about $140, $150. And this happened automatically. You did not have to apply for it or fill out any form or qualify it. The banks just made the switch, and everybody paid less the following months. That, of course, was also aimed to support Chinese households and entice them to spend more. So if Chinese households spend less, what does it mean for income growth and consumption, and what are the spending patterns behind the numbers? Well, according to the National Bureau of Statistics, in the first quarter of this year, 2025, China's nationwide per capita disposable income increased nominally by 5.5% year-on-year, reaching 12,179 RMB, which is around somewhere 1,600, almost $1,700. However, please keep in mind that China is a huge country, and that somewhat distorts that figure. Professionals in the big cities such as Shanghai or Beijing or in senior management jobs earn very competitive global salaries, and at the same time the salaries for low-level jobs or in the countryside are very low. Also, this was in Q1 this year, and I think we all know what happened in Q2 this year, which I could imagine we see reflected next year when we see further economic data about the rest of 2025. But in general, rural incomes are growing faster than urban incomes, helping to narrow the income gap. And despite a tight job market in China at this very moment and the economic headwinds due to a global downturn, the official data is actually not bad. China's retail sales continued their recovery of Q1 also in May 2025, with total retail sales of consumer goods reaching 4.13 trillion RMB, making a 6.4% year-on-year increase, the fastest pace since December 2023. Consumer demand for upgrade and lifestyle products remains strong, driven by trade-in subsidies, government vouchers, and a surge in online shopping ahead of the 18th June shopping holiday. That said, this year I actually barely noticed about it, but that may be me, Household appliances, communication equipment, office supply, and furniture saw growth rates between 25% and 53%, further boosted by rising foreign tourists' arrival thanks to expanded visa-free policies. Many countries can now come to China on a 30-day visa-free entry, and I'm personally seeing a lot of tourists in the street making good use to that. But there are, of course, concerns that the slight increase is mainly due to government stimulus and will fade once the stimulus stops. And why? Because many Chinese consumers remain cautious, holding back on spending despite government incentives. Personally, when I'm going to shops, and I'm kidding you, I'm not actually going to shops anymore, but when I walk down the street and I look into a shop, I can see that those shops tend to be empty, and a lot of retail places are closing or relocating, as much of their sales happen online. Not even in the big famous shopping streets where you have all the Apples, Pradas, and shiny brands of this world, it's not even very busy there. This cautiousness is partly due to economic uncertainties and the lingering effect of the pandemic. we also have to keep in mind that adult Chinese today have grown up in the miracle years of China's economy, while you and I, depending where you're from and how old you are, very likely had at least one large crash of economies in our home or nearby in our lifetime. We've been able to make the psychological experience with it. This is much more limited for the Chinese. If you have grown up with double-digit growth almost guaranteed, jobs available everywhere and annual salary increases of 10% or more at minimum, then the current climate of a slower job market, geopolitical uncertainties and harsh competition with single-digit growth makes one very, very nervous. A lot of it is psychologically, because we have to remember that even if China grows 5%, 4% or even 3%, it still objectively grows more than many other countries together. But subjectively, the individual people in China look around and see a quite worse scenario than that what they're used to. And this pushes down the confidence to buy into splurge and increases the wish to save money. When people are unsure in general, they tend to save. So the question is, if they don't spend it, where does the money go? And that brings us to the interesting topic of wealth accumulation and the housing market in China right now and the asset side of the equation. As a general rule, house ownership is the backbone of Chinese household wealth. This is also true culturally. So if you don't know, in order to get married, the groom or his family would usually be required to buy an apartment before the family of the bride will agree to marry. I made a whole video about the wedding industry, including the financial requirements Chinese men have to meet before becoming eligible for a wife, and their traditional customs and ceremonies when you're getting hitched, which I'm also going to link for you on the channel below. But long story short, for the longest time it was no house, no wedding. And while yes, this has changed a little bit and we see the emergence of something that is called naked weddings, house ownership as an entry ticket into marriage is still very, very normal. Also, all employees and all employers in China have to pay into what is called the housing fund. You can imagine it as a savings account where the company and the individual put a certain percentage of the gross salary in every month. And in the end, the employee can use these savings specifically to purchase a house. And this is mandatory. This is not opt-in, opt-out. And I think it shows really well the cultural emphasis that is placed on house ownership, which is much higher than, for example, in Germany. We also often buy houses, or actually, you know, in Germany, we like to build our own houses. It's a thing. But many are also completely fine to just live in a rental apartment their whole life. There's no looking down on someone who just rents their place as it is in other countries. So the drive for house ownership is often very culturally influenced. But the real estate market here is cooling and has not been great for some time, actually. We've had quite a bit of a crisis here during the pandemic, and many developers got into financial troubles and defaulted on their debts. My friend explained it to me in very simple terms how it works. So usually people buy a house off plan. Off plan means it's still in construction stage and not finished, you know, and then already pay the down payment. A few years ago, the average down payment for a house, for the first house that is, as the second one will be having a higher down payment because the government wanted to curb speculations for those people who have a lot of money, the down payment was somewhere 30%. I've heard that, for example, in Shanghai, this has now been reduced down to 15%, which of course is another way for the government to try to get its people to invest back into real estate and make it more feasible for them to buy something. But no matter how much down payment you pay, this money rarely goes into your own future house, as I understand it. It is used for the ones which are currently in construction. The money that actually builds your house will be paid by the next people who buy their house a little later. So yes, this is very simplified, but it's also the problem. So once the income stops, the whole industry gets into a standstill. And yes, I know the reality is multifaceted and much more complexer than that, but still. Suffice to say that recently, from 2020 to 2023, China's property market faced price declines due to regulatory tightening, developer debt issues, and economic uncertainty. Many houses had their construction halted and buyers were left with loans to pay off without a house being built. So it's a very unhappy situation. It's certainly not something that we would wish on anybody. In late 2023 to 2024, last year, new home prices fell sharply by over 8%, but government measures like mortgage easing and supplier and developer support have begun to slow the downturn. In general, as the government has a tight grip on capital outflow out of China, and some financial assets like Bitcoin or overseas investments are not available or hard to do for an average person, so much of the household investment has gone into property. Or I guess into gold. There was a lot of gold. There also was a lot of people, including maids, taxi drivers, and other lower income groups who invested a lot into the stock market somewhere in 2013, 2014. However, there was a crash in 2015 and many people lost money, so they're now quite a bit more careful in this asset class. Also, the stock market in China still works a little bit different than the ones you may know in Frankfurt or New York. And in general, while it's absolutely possible for a Chinese national to send money abroad, the max amount to do it easy is $50,000 per year. And while larger investments are absolutely possible, you really have to kind of jump through a lot of hoops and provide a lot of documents. China prefers the money to stay inside. This is also a problem for firms to repatriate their profit, but that's a topic for another time. Anyways, as property prices reduce, the household wealth reduces too. I personally have many friends who bought their house or apartment 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago and are now selling for a much lower price than they had originally planned to. This slowdown could dampen household wealth's growth going forward, a key consideration for sectors like real estate, construction, and consumer goods. The average Chinese family has 2 apartments, sometimes more. It would be common that each couple has at least one, then their children have one each. As the generations move their wealth downwards, the younger people living now or just growing up now are often expected to inherit the family wealth in houses and apartments. Therefore, if we are very realistic, if you see a lot of young people on the streets here in Beijing or in Shanghai, at some point they will be US dollar millionaires because they will inherit at least 2 houses from grandparents and their own parents, quite likely more than 2. So that gets you close to somewhere $1 million US, and in many cases above it, depending on the house. Of course, apartments in places like Shanghai are much more expensive than in the countryside, but the structure stays the same. And while they are not very likely at all to sell those houses in the future, it is a thought to keep in mind. Just looking at average income levels does not always paint the full picture. So by comparison, home ownership remains a major wealth pillar also in the US, but wealth inequality is there. The average American household's net worth is about 1.06 million US, but the median is just 192,000, meaning wealth is concentrated amongst the rich. So the question is about the social trends and consumer behavior. What's driving the saving? Because of the economic uncertainty, geopolitical tensions, and cautious government policies, they have fostered a culture of new thrift. For example, many younger Chinese save over 50–60% of their income. This is not just about money, it's about building resilience in an uncertain world. Despite government's efforts to boost consumption, many remain wary, preferring to save for healthcare, education, and retirement, especially given China's aging population and limited social safety nets. Even though social security has improved greatly over the last 2 years, the main danger is still medical bills. Compared to the US and many Western countries, China actually spends less per capita on healthcare, but offers near universal coverage through public insurance schemes covering over 95% of the population. However, out-of-pocket costs remain high in China, especially for major illnesses due to co-pays and deductibles, whereas countries like the UK and Germany provide a more comprehensive and equitable public coverage with lower out-of-pocket burdens. So in the case of a very serious illness that requires prolonged medical treatment, that's a big threat to everybody's family's financial planning. It is not uncommon that an apartment or a house has to be sold to cover the medical expenses. As family, even extended ones, including parents-in-law, usually see themselves as one unit, it would also not be uncommon to financially support the medical bills of one's parents and parents-in-law and, of course, their children. I would say that based on my personal observation, the biggest threat to household and family wealth are medical expenses. And what does the government want? Well, the government really wants its people to buy more, consume more, and save less. There has been a change of the growth model of China from a country that mainly produces and exports to what is called the dual circulation model by the Chinese government. Why dual circulation? Well, it prioritizes boosting domestic consumption and self-reliance, which we call internal circulation, while at the same time maintaining active engagement in international trade and investment, which we call external circulation. The government is pushing domestic consumption as a key growth driver to reduce dependence on foreign markets and external shocks, supported by policies to improve household income and expanding the middle class. To enhance supply chains for domestic production, Beijing has made boosting domestic consumption a top priority for this year, and I would expect the next years as well. The government has rolled out subsidies, tax relief, and policies to encourage spending, like doubling consumer goods trade subsidies to nearly 300 billion yuan. But structural reforms to improve social safety nets, healthcare, pensions, childcare, and so on are still evolving. Local governments face financial strain due to the property crisis and increased costs during the pandemic and reduced income of profit taxes by struggling companies right now. And this is limiting their ability to increase social spending. For this, you have to know that most of the tax revenue of local government comes from property sales tax, which have declined in the recent year. And of course, taxes paid by companies, which have also declined in the recent years due to the recovery after the pandemic and a cooling of the global economy worldwide. This means the shift from saving to spending will likely be gradual. There are many initiatives, however, already existing, and I would expect more to come. For example, there's the National Unified Market Initiative, as well as the government's various special initiatives to boost consumption, including converting export quality goods for domestic sales, including expanding trade-in programs for consumer products, and promoting consumption in telecom, healthcare, education, elderly care, and childcare services to meet diverse consumer needs. There are a bunch of other initiatives as well, which aim to increase wage growth and employment. However, they are currently facing challenges. There are also financial and fiscal reforms, such as local government debt replacement programs and consumption tax adjustments, providing more resources to improve public services and infrastructure, indirectly trying to boost consumption. So what does it mean for businesses? Are Chinese households going to continue saving more, or are they going to start making larger purchases again? While China as a country imports from places such as South Korea, Japan, Australia, and Brazil in terms of total US dollar volume, these are mainly for raw materials, components, and high-tech goods. When we look at consumer goods, then South Korea, Japan, and the United States are key sources of consumer electronics like smartphones, tablets, and accessories, which remain some of the most frequently imported consumer goods. European countries also supply textiles, fashion items, furniture, and home accessories, including everything from, chairs to tables and lighting. But that simply means, not considering tariffs at this moment, that if a country imports less from your country, your own companies will feel it. So you as a company selling into China want Chinese households to spend more because it is good for you directly. People are still saving a lot, so consumer spending is pretty cautious, especially outside the richer cities. Shops, entertainment, and service businesses might grow slowly but steadily, helped by government support and wealthier city folks. But honestly, it's hard to say what will happen if the government pulls back. The cooling housing market means we should be careful about real estate, about construction and related industries. Financial services and insurance could do well, since more people want smarter ways to manage their money beyond just saving. With an aging population and gaps between city and rural incomes, there's a growing need for healthcare, elder care, and education. Investors should keep an eye on government reforms because better social safety nets could help boost spending over time. So to sum it up, China's unique combination of high saving rates, cautious consumption, and evolving social policies creates both challenges and opportunities for businesses and investors. Understanding these dynamics along the contrasting patterns in the US and Germany is key to making smart decisions in 2025 and beyond. Thanks guys for watching. I personally think this is super interesting to see how everything is connected, not only within one country, but several countries, and it affects even your and my life, even if we're just little people doing our own thing. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, I would really appreciate it if you could hit like and subscribe, and maybe let me know in the comments what your own experience are. Are you able to save? And if yes, what do you invest your household wealth in? How is it different to China or in other countries that you know? How is it different to China? Looking forward to hearing from you. Bye guys!